How America dominated Mexico militarily. Why America and Mexico became unequal powers 1800 to 1830 in the first decades of the 19th century. The North American continent held two young nations standing beside each other, both new, both untested, both eager to define their future. But beneath the surface, the trajectories of the United States and Mexico were already partying in dramatic and irreversible ways. The story of American dominance over Mexico begins not on the battlefield, but in the quiet currents of demography, economics, and political stability. As the year 1800 dawned, the United States was a nation of just over 5 million people. Yet it was growing with astonishing speed. Waves of settlers flowed westward, clearing forests, founding towns, and multiplying communities that stretched from the Atlantic coast toward the Mississippi River. Families were large, immigration was steady, and opportunity seemed limitless. By 1830, the American population had tripled. This explosive growth gave the United States something priceless in military power: manpower, economic energy, and the ability to send settlers into new regions faster than anyone could stop them. The armed forces of a nation are ultimately built not just by soldiers, but by the society that supports them. Mexico, meanwhile, emerged from its War of Independence in 1821, exhausted and disunited. After 11 years of brutal conflict, cities lay in ruins, treasuries were empty, and regional leaders controlled local armies more loyal to themselves than to the new republic. While the United States built stable political institutions after its revolution, Mexico inherited deep fractures between royalists, republicans, federalists, centralists, and regional caudillas who shaped entire territories like private kingdoms. Mexico's population was not insignificant, around 6 to 7 million, but it was spread thinly across a vast landmass, with deserts, mountains, and poor roads dividing communities. Unlike the United States, Mexico struggled to project its authority across its northern frontier. In regions like Texas, Coahuila, and New Mexico, the federal government had limited presence and even less control. While Mexico battled internal fragmentation, the United States was rapidly industrializing. Northern factories produced rifles, gunpowder, iron tools, uniforms, and standardized equipment in quantities that Mexico could not match. The American economy found strength not just in manufacturing, but in its financial system, banks, credit networks, and a stable currency. Mexico, by contrast, entered independence with foreign debt, limited industry, and a silver-based economy that fluctuated wildly. Each financial crisis weakened its ability to supply an army, pay soldiers on time, or modernize equipment. By the late 1820s, the United States was already building the foundations of a national military complex. West Point began producing trained officers. The U.S. Navy expanded its shipbuilding capacity, and federal arsenals standardized weapons that would later play decisive roles in the Mexican-American War. But the greatest imbalance of all was political stability. The United States faced its own divisions, but its Constitution created a durable framework for elections, transitions of power, and national debate. Even when bitter conflicts arose, they took place within a stable institutional system. Mexico, however, changed governments at dizzying speed. Presidents rose and fell through coups, rebellions, and political infighting. Generals overthrew civilian leaders. Civilian leaders called on generals, and stability remained elusive. This meant that Mexico could not sustain long-term military planning, industrial programs, or consistent foreign policy. The fate of national defense depended on whichever faction happened to hold power at that moment. In these early decades, the United States did not yet dominate Mexico militarily, but the seeds had been planted. Demography, stability, economy, industrialization, and centralization formed the invisible scaffolding of future power. As Americans pushed westward with growing confidence and Mexico struggled to govern its northern frontier, a historic collision approached. The imbalance of the early 19th century was not the result of war. War merely revealed what had already taken shape. The path toward American dominance began long before the first shot was fired. It began in these decades of unequal growth and unequal stability, setting the stage for the dramatic events that would soon unfold in Texas and beyond. Texas breaks away. The first signs of American dominance, 1830 to 1836, by the early 1830s. Nowhere was the imbalance between the two nations more visible than in the sweeping lands of Texas. For Mexico, Texas was a northern frontier vast, sparsely populated, difficult to control, and constantly exposed to raids, migrations, and foreign influence. For the United States, Texas was a tempting expanse of fertile land, open for cotton cultivation and ideal for settlers seeking opportunity beyond the Mississippi. Mexico attempted to populate Texas to strengthen control, inviting American immigrants under the impresario system. At first, this was a strategic move: bring settlers to build farms, towns, and local defenses. But within a decade, the policy exploded beyond Mexico's control. American settlers poured into Texas by the thousands. By 1835, they outnumbered native-born Tejanos 10-1. Most brought with them the English language, Protestant faith, and crucially slavery, which Mexico had officially abolished. Cultural and political friction grew rapidly. Mexico tried to assert its laws, but its authority was weak. Its army stretched thin, and its northern frontier nearly impossible to govern. Settlers ignored restrictions, traded with the United States more than with Mexico, and carried American political ideas into Mexican territory. Demographic dominance became the first quiet stage of military dominance. Tensions escalated when Mexico attempted to enforce central authority. President Santa Anna abolished the Federalist Constitution of 1824, replaced it with a centralist regime, and demanded obedience from distant provinces. Texas resisted, claiming that Mexico had violated the constitutional order under which settlers originally agreed to live. Local militias formed, and soon the push for autonomy turned into open rebellion. Mexico sent troops north, but they faced enormous challenges. Roads were long, supplies scarce, and local resistance fierce. The battles of 1835 and 1836 revealed both the courage of Mexican soldiers and the severe weakness of Mexican logistics. At the Alamo and Goliad, Mexico won dramatic victories, but at immense cost. Santa Anna's harsh discipline and execution of prisoners only fueled Texan resistance. The decisive moment came at the Battle of San Jacinto in April 1836, in a stunning 18-minute assault. General Sam Houston's small Texas army crushed Santa Anna's larger force, captured the Mexican president, and forced him to recognize Texas independence. No single event better displayed the imbalance between the two nations. Mexico's army was brave but exhausted, undersupplied, and far from home. Texas forces were smaller but highly motivated, fighting close to their communities, and backed openly and secretly by American volunteers, weapons, and political support. Though the United States did not officially intervene, many Americans streamed into Texas to fight, reflecting the power of popular support and the weakness of Mexico's frontier control. When Texas became an independent republic, the world saw a symbolic truth: Mexico could not hold its northern territories against American population pressure. American migration, American ideology, or American arms. The Mexican government refused to accept the loss, but it lacked the strength to reverse it. Repeated attempts to retake Texas failed due to internal rebellions, financial crises, and political instability. Every year that Texas remained independent further exposed Mexico's inability to project military power into its own frontier. Meanwhile, the United States saw Texas as part of its natural expansion, a cornerstone of manifest destiny. American politicians, merchants, and slaveholding interests pushed for annexation. Mexico warned that annexation would mean war, but the warning carried little weight. Mexico's armies were fragmented, its economy weakened, and its leadership divided between rival factions. When the United States annexed Texas in 1845, Mexico called it an act of aggression. But the truth was already clear. The United States had dominated Texas by population long before it dominated by force. The Texas Revolution became the first undeniable proof that Mexico was militarily weaker than the United States, not because Mexican soldiers lacked courage, but because Mexico lacked the ability to govern, supply, and defend its distant lands. The stage was now set for the inevitable showdown. The annexation of Texas pushed the two nations toward a war that Mexico feared and America expected. But beneath the diplomatic tensions lay the deeper truth. The real cause of war was the imbalance created over decades, the imbalance that began with settlers crossing a border that Mexico could not control. America's dominance was no longer hidden. Texas had made it visible to the world. The road to war, annexation, diplomacy, and rising tensions 1836 to 1846 as the 1840s began. The continent held its breath. The fragile peace between the United States and Mexico existed only on paper, stretched thin across a decade of diplomatic resentment and unresolved claims. Texas, standing between them, functioned as both buffer and battleground, a symbol of national pride for Mexico and a symbol of manifest destiny for the United States. The two young nations moved steadily toward war, not merely because of a border dispute, but because of a widening gap in political power, economic strength, and military readiness. After the Texas Revolution, Mexico refused to recognize the Republic of Texas. Two Mexican leaders, Texas remained rightful Mexican soil, temporarily seized by rebels and sustained by American adventurers. But Mexico lacked the resources to retake the province as political instability immobilized its government. Presidents rose and fell in rapid succession, armies rebelled, and regional commanders acted independently. The nation could barely maintain internal order, let alone launch a major military expedition thousands of miles north. Meanwhile, the United States began watching Texas more closely. American farmers, cotton growers, and slaveholding states saw Texas not just as land, but as opportunity. The vast plains of Texas, suitable for cotton agriculture, would strengthen the Southern economy and expand political power in Congress. Northern interests resisted annexation, fearing the expansion of slavery. Yet economic ambition, combined with the ideology of manifest destiny, grew stronger by the year. Americans believed that expansion was natural, even divinely ordained. This belief shaped political decisions, news editorials, and frontier behavior. While Mexican governments struggled through repeated crises, the United States remained stable and ambitious. Presidents from Andrew Jackson to John Tyler courted Texas behind the scenes, offering protection and discussing annexation. Diplomats exchanged secret messages. American volunteers continued to cross into Texas, strengthening its militia. Every year that passed made Texas more American in character and more secure against Mexican reconquest. By 1844, annexation became a dominant issue in U.S. politics. A narrow defeat in the Senate delayed the process. But the election of James K. Polk, a fierce expansionist, changed everything. Polk believed America had the right to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and he saw Mexico not as a neighboring partner, but as a collapsing power blocking the continent's destiny. When the United States formally annexed Texas in 1845, Mexico reacted with outrage. Diplomatic relations were severed. Mexican newspapers demanded war. But the Mexican government broke, divided, and militarily weakened could not immediately act. While Mexico debated, President Polk prepared. He sent General Zachary Taylor to the disputed border region between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. To Mexico, this movement was an invasion. To the United States, it was defensive positioning. Yet in truth, it was intentional provocation. Polk hoped that a military incident would justify a war that he already believed was inevitable. His cabinet expected that Mexico would strike first. The geopolitical reality favored the United States, but public opinion required a moral pretext. Mexico, struggling with financial crisis and political paralysis, finally mobilized troops. President Mariano Paredes vowed to defend national honor, though the nation lacked resources. When Mexican cavalry engaged American forces in April 1846 and blood was shed, Polk declared that American blood has been shed on American soil, though the territory was still disputed. Congress, swept by nationalist fervor, voted overwhelmingly for war. The United States was now fully committed to a conflict it had long prepared for. Mexico entered the war with bravery, but without unity. Its generals distrusted the central government. Its armies were scattered, undersupplied, and poorly armed. Its treasury was empty. Despite the patriotism of its people, Mexico lacked the material foundation to fight a sustained war. The United States, on the other hand, mobilized with confidence. It possessed a growing navy capable of blockading Mexican ports. It had West Point-trained officers, standardized weaponry, and a political system capable of coordinating national war planning. American industry produced muskets, cannon, wagons, uniforms, and food supplies at levels Mexico could not match. Volunteers flooded into recruiting stations, inspired by patriotism, opportunity, and the promise of adventure. As the armies moved toward confrontation, the imbalance was clear. Taylor's forces were smaller than the total Mexican troops in the north, yet they were better equipped, better supplied, and protected by artillery superiority. Mexico's soldiers marched courageously, but their supply lines were long and unreliable, their weapons outdated, and their leadership divided. The United States had the industrial age behind it. Mexico still relied on the remnants of a colonial-era system. The road to war was not simply a series of diplomatic failures or a dispute over Texas. It was the collision of two nations whose paths had diverged long before the first shot. The United States possessed population growth, industrial power, political stability, and national ambition. Mexico fought bravely, but lacked economic strength, institutional unity, and the military infrastructure required to counter a rising continental empire. As armies prepared for the coming battles, history had already decided that the war would reshape North America. The U.S.-Mexico War begins. Why Mexico could not stop the invasion, 1846. The war that erupted in 1846 was more than a conflict over territory. It was a confrontation between two nations moving in opposite historical directions. When the first major battles unfolded on the plains of Texas and northern Mexico, the world witnessed not simply a clash of armies, but a revealing demonstration of military imbalance. Mexico fought with courage and conviction. The United States fought with structure, industry, and momentum. And in the opening months of the war, those differences shaped every outcome. When Mexican cavalry and American forces first exchanged fire along the Rio Grande, both nations understood that the conflict would determine the future of the continent. Mexico mobilized its northern armies and prepared to confront General Zachary Taylor, who had advanced deep into disputed territory. Mexican leadership hoped to strike a decisive blow early on that might encourage European support or force the United States to negotiate. But Mexico entered the conflict with severe disadvantages. Its soldiers were brave and numerous, yet chronically undersupplied. Many carried outdated flintlock muskets, some decades old. Ammunition supplies were inconsistent, uniforms scarce, and horses poorly fed. The Mexican army had experienced commanders, including General Mariano Arista, but leadership at the national level remained fractured by politics. As Taylor's forces held their position near the Rio Grande, Mexico saw an opportunity. Arista launched an attack, hoping to overwhelm the Americans before reinforcements arrived. This led to the first major battle of the war at Palo Alto on May 8, 1846. What unfolded became a textbook demonstration of American artillery dominance. U.S. flying, artillery light, mobile cannon that could reposition within minutes devastated Mexican formations. While Mexican infantry advanced courageously across the open plain, they faced a storm of well-aimed cannon fire that they could neither match nor avoid. Mexican artillery was heavier, slower, less accurate, and operated with fewer trained gunners. The open terrain made the disparity deadly. By the end of the day, Mexican forces withdrew. The very next day, at Resaca de la Palma, the pattern repeated. Mexico launched a determined attack in closed terrain, hoping that dense brush would negate American artillery. But American discipline, training, and cavalry effectiveness prevailed. U.S. dragoons charged Mexican positions, capturing aristas, camp, and artillery. Mexican forces retreated again, disorganized not for lack of bravery, but for lack of unified leadership and modern support systems. These two early defeats shattered Mexico's hope of driving the U.S. out of the Rio Grande region. They also revealed the core imbalance. The United States had fused industrial power with military doctrine, while Mexico relied on courage unsupported by infrastructure. Taylor pressed southward, capturing the city of Monterrey later in 1846 after intense urban combat. Mexican troops defended the city with ferocity, turning homes and rooftops into fortified positions. Yet even here, American tactics evolved. Instead of frontal attacks, U.S. forces adapted by moving house to house, breaking through walls and avoiding open streets where Mexican fire was strongest. Monterrey fell not simply because of manpower, but because American forces had the flexibility to learn quickly and apply structured command under pressure. While Taylor advanced in the north, the U.S. Navy implemented a strategy Mexico could not counter: a full blockade. American ships, powered by both sail and modernized gunnery, closed Mexican ports from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific coast. Mexico lacked a navy capable of challenging the blockade. This cut off international supplies, foreign loans, and critical imports of gunpowder and weapons. A nation without industrial bases depends heavily on foreign markets, and Mexico now found those markets closed. Meanwhile, the United States opened new fronts to stretch Mexico's defenses. General Stephen Kearny marched unopposed into New Mexico as local elites surrendered without major resistance. In California, U.S. naval and volunteer forces secured towns with surprising ease. Mexico simply did not have enough troops, supplies, or functioning command networks to defend its enormous northern territories. The early stages of the war proved a truth that had been building for decades. Mexico was fighting with valor, but without tools. The United States was fighting with strategy supported by industry, mobility, and unified command. Mexico hoped that capturing Taylor's army might force a negotiated peace. But each battle revealed that the United States possessed too many structural advantages. Modern artillery, standardized rifles, naval blockades, logistical networks, and stable political coordination all elevated American capabilities far beyond those of Mexico. As 1846 ended, the war was far from over, but the direction was clear. The United States would not simply hold its positions. It would carry the war deeper into Mexico. The imbalance revealed in the early battles set the stage for a campaign that would shape the continent: the march toward the heart of Mexico itself. America invades, the fall of the North and the West, 1846 to 1847, as 1846 gave way to 1847. The war between the United States and Mexico expanded across a continent. No longer confined to the borderlands of Texas, the conflict now stretched from the deserts of New Mexico to the fertile valleys of California and the rugged mountains of northern Mexico. The nature of warfare had changed. Mexico still fought courageously, but its armies could not match the scale, speed, and coordination of American operations. The United States did not simply win battles. It executed a multi-front invasion unprecedented in North American history. In the north, General Zachary Taylor advanced deeper into Mexico after victories at Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, and the capture of Monterrey. Taylor's army, composed of U.S. regulars and thousands of volunteers, marched through hostile terrain with disciplined supply lines and reliable artillery support. The farther they moved from the Rio Grande, the more Mexico's weaknesses became apparent. Local populations often supported their own army with food and shelter. But Mexico's national logistics system could not keep pace. Soldiers went unpaid, cavalry horses starved, ammunition ran short, and outdated muskets misfired at critical moments. Taylor's forces, though deep in enemy territory, maintained their fighting strength through America's superior supply networks. But while Taylor advanced in the north, the United States launched new offensives across the West, in the vast space between the Missouri River and the Pacific Ocean. General Stephen Kearny led the Army of the West toward Santa Fe. The expedition crossed deserts and plains with minimal resistance, not because Mexico lacked courage, but because it lacked presence. New Mexico, with its distant settlements and thin population, had never been strongly defended. When Kearny arrived in 1846, the local Mexican governor realized the futility of resistance and surrendered without a major fight. With New Mexico secured, Kearny pressed onward to California. California became the most dramatic example of Mexican absence and American ambition. Long before the war, American settlers, traders, and explorers had moved into the region. The Bear Flag Revolt, in June 1846, briefly established an independent California republic, but soon gave way to U.S. naval and marine intervention. The U.S. Navy, operating in the Pacific, captured coastal towns with swift efficiency. San Diego, Los Angeles, Monterey, and San Francisco all fell under American control. Mexican forces and California rancheros fought back in several engagements, displaying local heroism and resistance. Yet their efforts were fragmented and unsupported by Mexico City, which lacked the means to send reinforcements across deserts, mountains, and oceans. By early 1847, California slipped permanently from Mexico's grasp. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy extended its dominance along both coasts. Mexican ports such as Veracruz, Tampico, Mazatlan, and others were blockaded or captured. Without a navy of its own, Mexico could neither import critical supplies nor export goods to fund the war. The blockade strangled Mexico's economy, cut off foreign support, and weakened morale in towns dependent on trade. Every port lost was another artery severed in Mexico's national body. Back in the north, Taylor prepared for his greatest test, the Battle of Buena Vista. In February 1847, General Santa Anna returned from exile, rallied a massive Mexican army, perhaps 15,000 strong, and marched north to crush Taylor and reclaim territory. At Buena Vista, Santa Anna launched ferocious assaults across the rocky terrain, nearly overwhelming American positions. Yet despite numerical advantage, Mexico's attack stalled. American artillery once again proved decisive. Well-trained gunners fired rapidly, accurately, and with devastating effect. U.S. infantry held their lines against repeated charges, supported by the strong defensive position of the high ground. Mexican bravery was unquestionable, but their army suffered from inconsistent coordination, exhaustion, and logistical failures. When Santa Anna withdrew, Taylor's smaller army had survived another testament to the structural imbalance between the two nations. By the spring of 1847, the United States controlled northern Mexico, New Mexico, California, and the seas surrounding both coasts. But the war was not over. In fact, the most daring phase had yet to begin. President Polk, seeking a decisive end to the conflict, turned to General Winfield Scott to launch an invasion deep into the heart of Mexico. Scott did not intend to simply defend American gains. He intended to capture the capital of Mexico itself. In the north and west, Mexico had been pushed aside by American mobility, industrial support, and multi-front operations. But what came next would be unlike anything the continent had seen before. A coordinated amphibious invasion, a march to the capital, and the final demonstration of American military dominance. The fall of the North and West had set the stage. The fate of the war would now be decided in the valleys and mountains leading to Mexico City. The march to Mexico City, Scott's campaign and Mexico's collapse 1847 by early 1847. The United States held most of northern Mexico, but victory required something far more ambitious: capturing the capital itself. The man chosen to lead this near-impossible mission was General Winfield Scott, a commander known for discipline, organization, and strategic brilliance. Scott understood that Mexico City could not be taken by marching overland from Texas. The distance, terrain, and supply obstacles were too great. Instead, he planned an unprecedented amphibious assault on the Gulf Coast, followed by a direct advance into the heart of the nation. In March 1847, the U.S. Army executed the first major amphibious landing in American history at Veracruz. Thousands of troops disembarked from naval vessels in perfect coordination, forming battle lines along the beach within hours. The Mexican defenders, outgunned and unsupported by a navy, could not prevent the landing. Scott laid siege to the fortified city, using naval artillery and modern siege tactics. After weeks of bombardment and mounting casualties, Veracruz surrendered. The fall of Veracruz opened the gateway to Mexico's interior, just as it had centuries earlier for Hernan Courts. But Scott's campaign would be far more professional, disciplined, and devastating. From Veracruz, Scott marched west along the National Highway toward Mexico City. The road climbed into the mountains, winding through narrow passes, valleys, and strategic choke points where Mexican forces did fight fiercely. Santa Anna, once again commanding Mexico's army, mobilized tens of thousands of troops to block the American advance. At Cerro Gordo, Mexico built strong defensive positions along a mountain ridge overlooking the highway. On paper, the position was impregnable, but Scott and his engineers executed a daring maneuver. They discovered a hidden path through the forested hills, allowing American troops to flank the Mexican defenses. In April 1847, the battle erupted. American forces stormed the heights, capturing artillery positions and sending Santa Anna's army into retreat. The victory at Cerro Gordo shattered Mexico's attempt to halt the invasion early. Scott continued the advance, capturing towns along the route. Unlike Taylor's volunteers, Scott enforced strict discipline to prevent looting, winning the cautious respect of many local civilians. Yet, as the Americans climbed the plateau toward Mexico City, resistance intensified. The capital region was heavily defended by natural lakes, canals, and fortress-like positions. Santa Anna consolidated his forces, preparing for a final stand. The approach to Mexico City became a series of brutal battles fought across rugged terrain. At Contreras and Churubusco in August 1847, Mexican forces mounted fierce resistance. American troops fought through muddy fields, broken terrain, and fortified convents defended to the last by Mexican soldiers. Despite the bravery of the defenders, the superior coordination of American attacks, and the relentless discipline of U.S. infantry led to victory. Scott offered an armistice at Churubusco, hoping Mexico would negotiate peace. But internal political divisions shattered negotiations, and Santa Anna resumed fighting. Mexico City's final defenses lay at Molino del Rey and Chapultepec fortresses guarding the western approach to the capital. At Molino del Rey, one of the bloodiest battles of the war, American forces captured a key position but suffered heavy casualties. The true final barrier, however, was Chapultepec Castle, perched atop a rocky hill overlooking the city. Defended by regular soldiers, volunteers, and young cadets, Chapultepec became a symbol of Mexican courage. On September 12th and 13th, American artillery bombarded the fortress. When infantry scaled the steep slopes, Mexican defenders fought desperately. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. Chapultepec fell, and with it, the gates to Mexico City opened. On September 14, 1847, American troops marched into Mexico City. It was a moment that stunned the world. The capital of the largest nation in Latin America had fallen to an invading foreign army. The occupation did not come without resistance. Mexican civilians and irregular fighters launched a guerrilla campaign, attacking American patrols and supply lines. But the national government collapsed, Santa Anna fled, and Mexico lacked the unity to continue organized resistance. With the capital secured, the United States dictated terms of peace. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in early 1848, forced Mexico to cede half its territory land that would become California. Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Yet the territorial loss, dramatic as it was, told only part of the story. The deeper truth lay in the structure of the war. The United States had demonstrated a level of military power built upon industry, logistics, navy, trained officer corps, population, and political stability. Mexico had fought with immense bravery, but bravery alone could not overcome systemic deficiencies. Scott's march to Mexico City was not just the climax of the war. It was the final proof that the United States had emerged as the dominant military force in North America. Mexico's collapse was not the defeat of a weak nation, but of a nation weakened by internal conflict, economic limitations, and historical circumstance. The fall of Mexico City marked not merely the end of a war, but the beginning of a new continental order. Aftermath: how the war redefined the continent 1848-1853. When the cannons finally fell silent in 1848, North America emerged transformed. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo marked not just the end of the U.S.-Mexico War, the recreation of the continent's map and the birth of a new geopolitical reality. The war had been brief, brutal, and decisive, but the consequences that followed would echo for generations, reshaping nations, economies, cultures, and the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. Mexico, devastated by the war, entered a period of deep national reflection. The loss of half its territory was a trauma felt in every corner of society. Newspapers mourned the defeat. Politicians argued over responsibility, and countless families grieved for fathers, sons, and brothers lost in battle. Yet the greatest wound was psychological. Mexico had entered the war a proud republic, confident in its sovereignty, but it emerged humbled by the overwhelming power of its northern neighbor. Though Mexicans fought with valor, they could not overcome the structural weaknesses that had plagued the nation since independence. Deep political divisions between conservatives and liberals, Federalists and Centralists only intensified after the war. The economy, already fragile, suffered from the destruction of roads, loss of tax revenues from northern territories, and the expense of mobilizing armies that were never fully equipped to begin with. Mexico did not collapse, but it entered a long period of internal conflict, including civil wars and foreign interventions that would continue for decades. For the United States, the war produced the opposite effect. Victory energized American nationalism, reinforced the ideology of manifest destiny, and expanded the nation's territory to the Pacific, California, New Mexico, and the rest of the vast Mexican cession opened enormous opportunities for settlement, mining, trade, and agriculture. The discovery of gold in California, just months after the treaty signing, accelerated westward migration. Thousands of Americans and immigrants from around the world rushed west, establishing towns, goods, routes, and political institutions that would shape the character of the American West. The U.S. economy surged with the new wealth, fueling industrial expansion and strengthening national confidence. But the triumph masked deep contradictions. The vast new lands reignited the fierce national debate over slavery. Would these territories be free or slave states? The Mexican War, though victorious, intensified sectional tensions between North and South. Many Northern politicians viewed the conflict as a Southern plot to expand slavery. Southern leaders, in turn, saw it as an opportunity to extend their political power. The Compromise of 1850 temporarily eased tensions, but the long-term struggle over slavery would eventually erupt into the American Civil War. Thus, the war that expanded America's size also deepened the internal divisions that nearly tore the nation apart. The treaty also established a new border between the two nations, but not without ambiguity. In the years that followed, both governments realized that the boundary through the Gila River region was poorly suited for a transcontinental railroad. In 1853, the United States pushed for additional land leading to the Gadsden Purchase. Mexico, desperate for revenue and seeking stability, reluctantly agreed to sell a smaller strip of land in what is now southern Arizona and New Mexico. This final sale completed the modern continental outline of the United States. Diplomatic consequences extended beyond borders. The war signaled to the world that the United States had become a rising continental power. European nations, even those once dominant in the region, recognized America's growing military and economic might. The Monroe Doctrine, once a mere statement of principle, now seemed backed by real force. Latin American nations watched with anxiety, fearing that American expansionism might one day turn toward them. Mexico, in particular, feared that the United States might continue its territorial appetite. Though the U.S. had secured what it wanted, the memory of invasion lingered within Mexican society, shaping attitudes toward its northern neighbor for generations. The aftermath of the war did not bring peace to Mexico. The internal divisions that had weakened the country before the war only grew heavier afterward. In the decades following the conflict, Mexico endured a series of revolutions, coups, and civil wars. The struggle between conservatives and liberals, between centralized authority and federalist ideals exploded into the Reform War. The instability opened the door to foreign intervention, culminating in the French invasion of the 1860s and the brief reign of Emperor Maximilian. All of these crises trace their roots back, in part, to the structural weaknesses exposed by the war with the United States. Meanwhile, the United States marched confidently into its new era. Railroads connected the coasts. Settlers filled the valleys. Ports expanded. Military academies grew more influential. The U.S. government, now with a coastline on both oceans, envisioned itself not just as a continental power, but as a global one. The Mexican War had been the training ground for many officers who would later shape the Civil War Grant. Lee, Jackson, McClellan, and others. They had learned the harsh realities of modern warfare across Mexican terrain. The experience of the war had strengthened America's military institutions and given it greater confidence in projecting power. Outside its borders, the war's consequences were vast and profound. It had redrawn maps, redirected economies, reshaped identities, and repositioned the United States and Mexico along dramatically different paths. The conflict revealed the face of a new continental order, one in which the United States emerged as the military and economic giant of North America, while Mexico struggled to rebuild and redefine itself. The aftermath of the war was not just the end of a conflict, it was the beginning of a new era, one that would shape the destiny of the continent for centuries to come. Why America dominated Mexico militarily. Deep analysis to understand why the United States dominated Mexico militarily. One must look beyond the battles, the generals, and the tactics. The deeper truth lies in the structural forces that shaped both nations from the moment they emerged as independent republics. The War of 1846 to 1848 was not simply won on the fields of Palo Alto, Buena Vista, or Chapultepec. It was won over decades of divergent development. Two nations shared the same continent, but their paths were profoundly different. Demography was the most decisive force. By the 1840s, the United States had a population of over 20 million people, more than 3 times that of Mexico. This numerical advantage allowed the U.S. to field larger armies, sustain long campaigns, replace losses, and continue economic production even during wartime. Mexico, in contrast, had a primarily rural population scattered across vast geography, with limited ability to mobilize large forces without devastating local economies. The simple reality of population density translated directly into military capacity. Industrial power was equally important. By the mid-19th century, the United States was rapidly industrializing. Factories produced rifles, artillery, wagons, uniforms, gunpowder, and supplies at rates impossible for Mexico to match. The U.S. Navy operated steam-powered ships, modern coastal guns, and standardized ammunition. American soldiers carried reliable percussion muskets, while many Mexican troops used outdated flintlocks. Logistics: the ability to move, feed, arm, and supply armies became the backbone of military dominance. While Mexico relied on improvised supply chains and regional mobilization, the United States built an integrated system capable of supporting multi-front operations thousands of miles from home. Political stability formed the third pillar of American military strength. The U.S. Constitution created institutions that, despite internal conflicts, ensured stable leadership. Predictable transitions of power and continuity in military planning. Mexico, by contrast, suffered chronic instability. The decades after independence saw presidents overthrown, constitutions rewritten, and rival factions battling for control. Armies were loyal to generals, not institutions. National defense planning was inconsistent, funding unreliable, and long-term modernization nearly impossible. A nation perpetually fighting itself cannot effectively defend its borders. The fourth factor was geography and how each nation used it. Mexico was vast and difficult to govern. Mountain ranges, deserts, jungles, and poor roads isolated its regions from one another. The northern frontier, including Texas, New Mexico, and California, was sparsely populated and nearly impossible to reinforce quickly. The United States exploited this weakness by sending settlers, traders, and soldiers into territories Mexico could not effectively govern. When war came, U.S. forces simply filled the vacuum left by Mexico's limited presence. The fifth factor was military doctrine and training. The United States benefited from West Point, which produced a generation of disciplined officers trained in engineering, artillery science, logistics, and modern warfare. Mexico's officers, though often brave and talented, came from varied backgrounds and lacked standardized training. American artillery, commanded by well-educated officers, proved lethal at Palo Alto, Resaca de la Palma, and Buena Vista. American engineers, trained in mathematics and fortifications, planned the assaults on Veracruz and Mexico City with scientific precision. Scott's campaign succeeded because of a level of coordination and professionalism that Mexico simply could not match at the time. Naval power was another decisive advantage. Mexico had no navy capable of resisting the U.S. blockade. The United States cut off Mexico's ports, disabled foreign trade, and secured supply lines across oceans. Control of the sea allowed the U.S. to land troops at Veracruz, supply armies in California, and execute a strategic encirclement that Mexico had no answer for. Naval supremacy alone did not win the war, but without it, victory would have been impossible. Internal unity also played a crucial role. American public opinion, though divided on slavery, overwhelmingly supported the war. Volunteers joined in the tens of thousands. Newspapers praised military victories and celebrated national expansion. Mexico, however, entered the war with deep internal divisions. Regional elites distrusted the central government. Indigenous communities viewed the war as distant from their own concerns. Political factions sabotaged one another. In several cases, Mexican generals refused to cooperate due to personal rivalries. This fragmentation weakened national resistance at the moment unity was most needed. Finally, ideology shaped the conflict. Americans believed in manifest destiny, the idea that expansion across the continent was a divine mandate. This belief propelled settler migration, political decisions, and military campaigns. Mexican ideology, shaped by the legacy of Spanish colonialism, emphasized sovereignty, identity, and the struggle to maintain national territory. But belief alone could not substitute for military capacity. The war became a confrontation between a nation expanding with purpose and a nation defending itself while burdened by internal struggles. When viewed through this deeper lens, the domination of Mexico by the United States becomes not merely a story of battles, but a story of asymmetry and imbalance created by history, economics, culture, and geography. The war exposed these differences dramatically, but it did not create them. America's industrial capacity, political unity, and demographic strength had been rising for decades. Mexico's internal challenges had been accumulating since independence. When the two nations finally collided, the outcome was determined less by the bravery of soldiers on both sides, more by the forces shaping the world behind them. The War of 1846 to 1848 was the moment when these historical currents converged. It was the moment when the United States emerged as a continental power and Mexico was forced to confront the painful reality of its vulnerabilities. The domination of Mexico was not the triumph of one people over another, but the triumph of structure over fragility, of stability over instability, of industry over exhaustion. It was a turning point in the history of North America, one whose consequences continue to define the continent to this day.